You're on, Paul.
Right, let's see if we have the screen share. Is the screen share functional?
Yes.
Yes.
Right, I'm wanting to begin this evening with a preliminary note that this is June 27. And I say that because June 27 is significant in Restoration history. And you notice that on the list I have Joseph Smith Sr. died in September of 1840. Carlos, that's Joseph's youngest brother, died in August of 1841. He was the editor and publisher at the Times of the Seasons, where I've been digging this summer, and so I've been getting more acquainted with him and have a lot of respect for the gentleman. And then his wife and daughter are also people of remarkable accomplishment. But then we have Joseph and Hiram were assassinated on this date 178 years ago. And then Samuel died just 30 days later in July. And this was the first assassination, to the best of my knowledge, of a presidential candidate during a presidential campaign. That was 1844. Robert Kennedy would be the second, and I think that's all we've had, fortunately. But the fact that Joseph Smith was running to be president of the United States and was assassinated on this date 178 years ago strikes me as being a significant common historical note for those of us that are part of the Smith-Rigdon tradition. And so I wanted to simply highlight that as a historical factor for the day. There was one brother left, that was William, and William survived until 1893. He had the privilege of going back to Kirtland for the 50th year celebration of the Kirtland Temple. That would have been 86. And I was the only person who had been there in 1836 who was there able to share his memories of that remarkable experience. We were endowed by the Holy Spirit. All right, so much for the historical comment. Let me, if I can get screen share to slideshow. Now then, our speaker, presenter this evening is Jerry Grover. He's the author of many publications available on the Book of Mormon, and you'll find them on the Book of Mormon Central website. That includes his translation of the Characters document, Geology of the Book of Mormon, Ziff, Magic Goggles and Golden Plates, the Nephite Great Spirit Religion and the Amalekite Religion, Travel Path of the Jaredites, Evidence of the Nehor Religion in Mesoamerica, and the Swords of Shul, which is a remarkable volume by itself. They're all available for download at no cost. And Jerry has also sponsored and published the remarkable linguistic work by Brian Stubbs, relating the Semitic cognates with those of the Uto-Aztecan family. So his contributions have been awesome, and it's a real honor to have him with us as a presenter. He has been participating with insightful comments and questions, and he has tonight he's coming to share with us about metallurgy in the Book of Mormon. And so I am delighted to welcome him back and encourage you all to give him your best questions. Ed Fonts will remember that Jerry is the one who pointed out that the volcano and earthquake action offered a good explanation of what happened at the time of Christ's death. And I remember Ed Fonts pointing out that pretty well undercut the Iowa idea that Zarahemla could be in Iowa, because there are just not very many volcanoes in Iowa. But let us pray. Smelter of the universe, designer of diverse minerals and ores, we acknowledge you this evening as creator of unlimited skies, unlimited elements, unlimited stars. And we look to you as craftsmen beyond the smelting heat, whose refining fire melts the boundaries between our finite perception and your infinite, merciful judgment seat, whose artisanship in mountains, birds, flowers, and seas puts us in awe appreciative yet humbled on our knees. For you not only bless us with snapshots of your creativity in sunsets every day, you bless us with promise of eternal life if we but follow. This evening we ask your blessing on our gathering and on our presenter, Jerry Grover, that your spirit will dwell within and without to gently hover, that our insight in the scriptures concerning metals will be given refinement, empowering a more understanding effect as we expand our appreciation of your creative processes, giving them eternal respect. And as we examine comparative values in metals and in life, we ask that you guide us in our applications of the lessons from the scripture to the refinements available through strife. For we recognize that you have made us. We need refinement to find the good within our cores, and we face the fires of the eternal cauldron to participate in the music of eternal spheres. We pray in the name of the Master Refiner, Jesus. Amen. Jerry, thank you for coming back, and welcome to the forum again. The floor is yours.
Hey. And everybody, did I share the screen well enough or did not?
We're not seeing it yet, Jerry.
Okay, let me, didn't do the share right here. Bring it up.
There you go. It says Ziff.
Yep. Okay. Okay. Paul mentioned going to talk about metals. Actually, probably I'm only going to have time to talk a little bit about metals in general at the end, and so I didn't really put it as part of the presentation. I'm going to talk a lot about Ziff, and kind of wonder how can you talk 45 minutes about one word, but hopefully you'll see kind of how expansive it can get. As Paul mentioned, I wrote a book some time ago called Ziff, Magic Goggles and Golden Plates. And so I dealt with Ziff. Second half of the book, I dealt with the metallurgy and kind of explained how the gold plates were constructed. And I was going to try to talk about that. I just, as I've put this together, I don't think I'm going to have enough time. So, but we'll see how it goes. In the 19th century, that's where this the name of my book came from. Is there was an anti-Mormon origin bachelor. He made the following challenge. He said, "What kind of metal is Ziff? Come, Joseph, on with thy goggles and translate thy translation. Tell us what Ziff means." So hopefully it's a few hundred years late, but I think maybe I can answer that question for Mr. Bachelor. One of the more intriguing words in the Book of Mormon that was not theoretically, I guess, translated or interpreted was Ziff. And it occurs only in Mosiah 11, and it's in the portion it's talking about when King Noah came to power. It first mentions it was part of a fifth of the tax of a variety of things, primarily some metals, but also grain and fatlings. And it's also mentioned again in the construction of buildings that Noah did. It's mentioned as being on the outside of these elegant and spacious buildings, and it ornamented them with these things, including Ziff. In the palace, inside of the palace and the throne, it is not mentioned. So looking at the text, So the goal here is say, can we actually figure out what Ziff was talking about? And narrowing it, given the other items that were in the list, it appears to be a metal alloy, or some sort of specialty metal. It was only used on the exterior of those buildings. Since a fifth of the Ziff was used for building ornamentation, it does not appear that there were large volumes in circulation of the material. That seems to be what was only put to that use. The original manuscript does not have this section, but the printer's manuscript does. And there it is capitalized. The word Ziff is capitalized where it occurs, while the surrounding words aren't. Now, capitalization in the original manuscript and even the printer's manuscript isn't necessarily this uniform scheme. In fact, Skousen, in doing, in his original text project, he's kind of just ignored capitalization because to some extent it does have, it's a little bit random. But I think in this situation, it seems to have been maybe there on purpose. Again, being a dictated text like the Book of Mormon was, it may have been a scribal preference, or it's possible Joseph Smith actually indicated it was a capital letter. We know what it's not by process of elimination, because gold, silver, copper, iron, brass, and steel are mentioned elsewhere. So we'd assume it cannot be any of these. And that's also important. The only use of the term in the Book of Mormon is found in conjunction with King Noah. It's not found elsewhere. So the first question that comes to mind, and this is not only for Ziff, but is why was the word Ziff not translated in the first place? And here's a couple potential reasons. Is it may have been had some special meaning such that it was left in the form that it is. If so, the premise is perhaps we could figure out the meaning of it. It would be kind of strange if the translator left a term untranslated that he didn't think we could somehow figure out. So the other thing that could have happened is knowing that the target language of the translation or interpretation was the King James Version of language of the Bible, and also early modern English. Not exclusively, there's some other things there that was discussed a little bit last week. The word may not have been available in English prior to that time, 1500s. Let's say there was a cutoff there, meaning it wasn't in English, so it wasn't available to actually include as a translation. Hope that makes sense what I said there. So we're going to kind of attack it from a couple of those two angles and see what we can figure out. Like I mentioned, from patterns in the printer's manuscript, there's a distinct possibility that it enjoyed some special religious designation or status, identical to Gesalem, capitalized, which I think it's describing one of the interpreters, because that's where it's talking about. Other people have other theories, but they have the Liahona, the Ramyampton, and perhaps Deseret as well. Sheem is another one of the unknown capitalized terms, and it's in a list of agricultural items. And I kind of determined, this is my basically research, is that it's because I've kind of figured out, and I have a premise that some of these unknown words and the Jaredite names are constructed with Sumerian etymology. They're constructing them in the way in Mesoamerica they constructed names, especially place names. So it's not straight Sumerian. You can't go to Sumerian and find this name typically, but you can actually construct it as a compound word, which Sumerian was an agglutinated compound type language. So it actually is somewhat consistent. Basically for Sheem, it looked like it's talking about amaranth. It's just a red grain. And in Mesoamerica, it is used in basically, it's especially for religious rituals because it's the color of blood. They made little kind of tortilla cakes, tamales out of them. It was given in the form basically offered to certain deities. So it seems to be, maybe it's talking about it's a good candidate for the Nephite Christian sacrament. Utilized it. It would have matched, Christ's blood, etc. I also think Deseret maybe because, the fact they're talking about honeybees, which they didn't even take over across the waters. but maybe they were using sacramental wine based on honey, which they haven't necessarily. So I think it's possible. I mean, I think it's kind of likely that maybe there is a specific religious correlation with Ziff. Now, of course, it's talking about Noah, so we would expect a negative one, not necessarily a positive. The other thing, so that's kind of the religious discussion generally that we'll start to look at. So the other thing is, okay, let's say we have this cutoff in somewhere in the 1500s in terms of language. So I used all of the dictionaries, et cetera, at that time and said, okay, are there any metals that were not, the words were not available at that time in English? And so this is a list of all those that were found. And I'm not going to read them all. Some are not very common, obviously. So basically, after doing that, and also the alloys that were present, we have the potential remaining metals that were not identified: vanadium, lithium, cesium. Again, not very common, and none of them were produced anciently. So, so we're kind of left, if we're taking that approach to say, okay, what could Ziff have been if it wasn't available in English at that time as a word? You're looking at some sort of an alloy or specialized form of a known alloy, or a known base metal that had some kind of unique surface treatment. So you're looking at something, maybe it's not talking about a pure base metal. It doesn't appear. So what about the etymology of Ziff? First, and this is another one of kind of my premises that probably, I don't know that I've published it a little bit, but it was just a mystery to me, or was something, again, it wasn't making any sense in the Book of Mormon, is that the names and unknown words in the Book of Mormon look to be phonetically based on standard biblical Hebrew, Egyptian, and constructed Sumerian. And what I mean by that is we're not looking at modified terms through time of what you would expect happens to a word if the language is basically changing, and especially in the case of these three languages, because you're in a foreign place where you're surrounded by languages that aren't even close, you would have expected some modification, sound shifting of these types of words. Now, like Brian Stubbs has shown, he has applied all of those historical linguistic principles to show that, in fact, Neo-Aztecan, you can find these. Of course, they've undergone sound shifts, just like the rest of the language has. But it does seem that we're looking at a translator preference, similar to what was discussed a little bit last week, is that the interpretation or translation is utilizing biblical Hebrew from a certain time frame, also Egyptian and Sumerian. We're not looking at changed phonetic words. So point being is that we could maybe expect to find Ziff in one of these language groups. So not looking for, Ziff as it maybe existed. I mean, King Noah was what, about 400 or 500 years after, 400 years something after Lehi departed. So you would expect, well, maybe it's some changed word, but I don't think that's what's happening in the Book of Mormon. So we should be able to find it. So I basically said, okay, and I had the assistance of David Calabro, who's fluent in Arabic, and because I'm not, in all of the language that we're going to look at. And so we said, let's look at and see if we can find some metallic or kind of related term that might sound similar to the phonetics in Ziff. And we'll just look kind of at the modern language first, and then kind of use that and go back and see if we can figure out. So first, in biblical Hebrew, Ziff with this spelling is not present in the Bible. Of course, one thing you got to recognize about the Bible, about biblical Hebrew, is it's estimated that only a fifth of the biblical Hebrew is present in the Bible, meaning 4/5 of the language is not there. So we don't have all these other words that maybe that were being used, it just didn't happen to make it in the Bible. It's also important in the Bible, since we're talking about a potential metal, to recognize that a lot of the metallic or earth product terms in the Bible are loan words. They weren't necessarily, came out of Hebrew. They were borrowed in from adjacent cultures. And these are examples. I didn't put in the Hebrew, but you have tin, iron, glass, clay. These have all been identified as being borrowed in. Now, some of them were probably borrowed in and then actually were there at the time of the writing of that particular portion of the Bible. So it wasn't like they just got loaned in when it was written. But they came in earlier as a loan word. So you have Akkadian, Sumerian, Egyptian, Old Persian, Sanskrit, and with cognates also of some of the words found in other Semitic languages. So they could even have been borrowed in, even though they're a cognate, they may have been borrowed in. It's just something that's kind of different about the metals and earth products that you find in the Bible. So kind of following this pattern, we can also look for loan words, meaning if we find it in a language that's adjacent geographically to Israel, that we might expect that's a possibility. It was found that in biblical Hebrew as a loan word. So we want to look at all those. As far as in biblical Hebrew, the Bible does contain one similar word in the form of the Canaanite, one of the Canaanite months, Ziv. But it's basically, they don't really know actually the source of it, but some have indicated it came from the word for brightness of flowers. The current LDS Book of Mormon has a footnote on Ziff that says there are related words in Hebrew. One's the adjective shining, but it doesn't give us any references. So I'm saying presumably is that from Ziv that they're making that, putting that in there. And then they also say, and the verb to overlay or plate with metal. Again, they give no reference, so you don't really know what Hebrew word they're talking about. Looking at the terms in the Bible, probably for overlay for those words, for that definition, that verb, it looks like they were probably looking at sapah. And Brian can connect me. My Hebrew, I don't pronounce very well any of that, or sapah, and then sipui. But these don't seem to be very close to Ziff, to be honest with you. So if they're related, it may only be tangentially. So looking at modern Hebrew dictionary, you do find this word that means to forge, falsify, counterfeit, adulteration. So it has a possibility of being related to metals, but that's the only one that came up. So presumably, if we're looking for Ziff in biblical Hebrew, you would expect the letters Zayin, Yod, and Fe, which, and again, you have to remember there's really no vowels written in the biblical Hebrew, so there's always interpolation. In this case, you have the Y, which I guess could technically be a vowel that is present. The other question is you have this double F, which is interesting because it doesn't really render a separate. You don't say the F twice in English. So it kind of what I'm supposing is maybe it represents at least that Fe, when they wrote it at the end of a word, they wrote it differently. So perhaps that's designating that, but that's another curious item about it. So looking at Arabic, the best candidate that was a good match. So we looked at biblical Hebrew. If we're looking at Arabic, it's Ziff. And it also, similar to the Zaif in the Hebrew, means counterfeiting, forging, falsify, but it's also specifically talking about money. So coinage, and it's to change the surface of the coinage to make it counterfeit. Spurious is another kind of, they give that as a definition: false, unreality, imitate. Egyptian Arabic has a similar term, counterfeit. So we know it's in, it looks like that word is in Arabic, has some relation a little bit to a metal of some sort, a counterfeit type metal. So we went to all of the old lexicons, Arabic lexicons, and we have a lot of those. We don't necessarily have a lot of those like in Biblical Hebrew or some of the other languages there, but because these lexicons, they're relying on the language at the time, and they give you examples from the literature of use of that particular word. So we went through all of the Arabic, very old lexicons, which were actually in Arabic, most of them, and did come up with a bad dirham. Dirham is the coin that they used, Arabic coin. It could either be gold or silver. It also had battlements or upper part of buildings as part of the definition of Ziff. Yeah, these are just some of the different lexicons, Ubab, Lisan al-Arab. Kind of interesting is down here on this number 4, it says the clinking of Ziff received as payment in Abkar. And it's bad money is what they call it. Also in the Misbah, it talked about kind of the technique that they think was indicated that you would produce as Ziff, and it's you would coat a base metal, not valuable one, but had similar weight as gold, meaning a heavier one like lead or something. And they would use a mercury quicksilver compound with sulfur, and then use that chemically to create the color, either a gold or they could also do silver color. Again, we also have a top of the wall now, battlements. Again, bad money, so impure. So it actually went through quite a few of these lexicons and was fairly consistent. Also of interest was there are some additional ones that were referring to strutting animals, including pigeons, doves, and humans. So as is apparent, Ziff was a word with documentation to the earliest lexicon and Arabic sources available, circa late 8500. And basically, since Arabic script was known before 8500, but not much, it's found in a few funerary inscriptions. It does seem like Ziff is clearly an ancient Arabic word that could easily project back to the beginnings of the Arabic language and well into the times preceding Lehi. So it does look like, just from the Arabic, we might could say, hey, that could be clearly a loan word from a language that was geographically adjacent to the Hebrew. Now, we're going to kind of talk a little bit in Arabic. What is interesting is, as we mentioned, it seems that it's related to metal, counterfeit, or bad money, bad gold. I kind of mentioned that it seems like the actual coin weights were tooled and then coated gold. It could also be, they would boil off the mercury and leave this gold colored surface, or also silver. And it's a common ancient technique is found in other Greek coins were known to counterfeit the drachma in this way. So it's not an unknown technique. And they did it kind of close to the same weight, obviously, so they could pass it off as a fake gold coin. So it's also, as we're going to talk about, as I mentioned, this use of the money in Akbar was kind of interesting. Abkar was kind of interesting because that's not a known geographical location. It's not an Arabic location. It's actually a supernatural location. It's the city in the invisible world of the jinns. And it mythologically predates Islam, so it's not an Islam-generated idea. It's also the name given to the highest ranks of demons. Satan's the lowest, but Abkar is the top. So jinn, which is the plural for genie, you know, as we watch Disney movies, these evil things in Disney movies. But they are mentioned frequently in the Quran. So the kind of the question is, okay, so we have this meaning. Is it possible maybe that the biblical Hebrew, they also had some recognition or link to this particular metal or basically metallic product related to evil. And I think I'm basically saying I do think that there's at least some connection, possible connection. The old Arabic translations of the Hebrew text of the Bible translated these terms like burning fiery ones as jinn or jan, familiar spirit, the devil. And also like in the apocryphal book, Testament of Solomon, again, it's mentioned as these particular demons. So basically you have the Arabic translating them as jinn. So there may be some at least knowledge that this term actually had these kind of negative religious connotations. And this is just a depiction of the demon jinn shaitan, which I actually thought kind of looks like some of the paintings people have done of King Noah in the Book of Mormon. Again, the other thing that's interesting is just like in the Book of Mormon, talks about it being used as ornamentation on the buildings. We saw in the lexicons that it was in fact utilized in the top of the battlements, probably in a similar way. Also, the fact that it has an animal correlation means it was probably used. They used to put little animal figures as talismans at the top of the buildings or entrances to the cities. They call it apotropia, which basically is kind of a protection from, they could have like snakes, where it would protect from snakes entering the city or evil demons entering the city. So it did have a clear religious connotation to it. Interestingly, and this was actually quite helpful, is I found it over in Persian, which with similar meaning. So I thought, well, that's curious. I mean, it's not that far away. But as I did the research on Ziff, it's actually because Persian isn't even part of the same language group as Hebrew or Arabic. So you're looking, okay, it's got some kind of loan. It's obviously a loan of some sort. But actually, it's interesting because some linguists have determined that it came from this enclave Jewish language they call Lotarai, which is Jewish dialect in Persia. And the evidence is that it came out with the Babylonian exile, not the early Assyrian one, with the one of Lehi. So, and they've kind of indicated comes from an Aramaic source. Now, it's kind of interesting because that does give us the ability to say it probably it was available as a word for Lehi. I mean, the Lehites had it as a word, probably in maybe not Biblical Hebrew, at least Aramaic, which is also interesting because Brian Stubbs is on, but one of the things Brian determined is that there is Aramaic also mixed in with the as part of the Semitic group of terms in Indo-Aztecan. So it does seem clear they had some knowledge, that Lehites probably had some knowledge of Aramaic. I suppose maybe the people of Mulek could have had it. I don't know. But anyway, so that investigation does put the word back in the time frame where we need it. Again, it's just talking a little bit about ancient Aramaic and kind of the fact that Hezekiah did speak it. People didn't, but it was kind of a lingua franca at the time. So the summary to this point is we've established that Ziff is probably an Aramaic word, or at least derived from Aramaic into the Hebrew. Was known to Israel dating back to the Babylonian exile, time of Lehi, because it was found in this Jewish enclave in Persia. We've also established that it has as an ancient Arabic word, which means a form of counterfeit gold or silver, which would involve the gilding of a base metal with a surface of gold or silver, at least color or perhaps the metal itself. We established that the metallic words of biblical Hebrew are in fact loan words, most of them. So it's an easy pathway into biblical Hebrew from Arabic, if that's where you're looking for a source. We've established that it has evil religious connotations. as it was the counterfeit money used in the realm of devils. We've established it was used as an adornment on buildings with specific superstition or religious purposes in the form of animals, specifically birds. So we have that kind of knowledge of it. Now, looking at a Mesoamerican setting, most Mesoamerican models have the city or land of Nephi where Noah was located in the valley where the city of Guatemala City is located. And that was, I think, Paul showed you kind of a circle of that area. One of the slides of the first is the main city there anciently was Camino Juyu, which was a significant trade center. So looking at it, we also have this kind of connection with the birds, which I talked about very much, which meaning it was kind of there. But it's also interesting because in the Maya, the kings would actually take on the divine presence during ritual performances. And the primary god of the Maya at that time, actually for most of the time, was the principal bird deity. It's also known as Sun. And there is a sculpture in Camino Juyu showing a king with the headdress, with the bird headdress. It's kind of, there's the beak, etc. So they would basically, when they donned these, they would kind of take on they were viewed as the gods themselves on earth. So our correspondence so far with King Noah is just like Noah is a counterfeit king, so is Ziff more or less a counterfeit metal. It was used as a decorative element on buildings in the old world, just as Ziff was described as being used in the new world. Excuse me, that should say new world. Sorry there. Ziff in the old world was used in relation to magical and superstitious bird figures. Noah as king was a divine representation on earth as the primary Maya god, the principal bird. So we don't have, obviously the detail of the Book of Mormon doesn't say what form the ornamentation was, but I think it would certainly make sense that would have been some of these bird figures. Now there's a sideline question that basically this is new research that isn't really related to the metal, but it's basically the question that always comes up. Since Book of Mormon names are metonymic, meaning they're describing the people or the place, why would King Noah get the name of a righteous Old Testament prophet? But in English translations of the Bible, there are two characters named Noah. One is a man and one is a woman. In Hebrew, the two names are totally different. Their meanings are opposite. The Noah first mentioned, the female, in Numbers 26:33, as one of these five daughters. I don't even know if I can pronounce this right. Zelophehad. The second one is what we know in the book of Genesis, pronounced Noach, I guess, technically, which is the prophet that we know of, the famous prophet. Interestingly, when you look at the etymology of the female name for Noah, it comes from the verb nuah, which means to shake or stagger. And interestingly, in Psalms, it's basically utilized describing drunks who stagger, or corn tossed in a sieve. So, as we know, in the Book of Mormon, King Noah planted vineyards and wine pressers and became a wine bibber, and also his people. So this female term for Noah actually matches Noah fairly well. And then it's also when Cain fled, he went to the land of Nod, which is also derived from the verb. So it's basically a place where Cain lived or fled to. So kind of interesting that I think that we do have the metonymic name for Noah. It's not the righteous one. Question is, though, okay, why would they use a feminine name for King Noah? It's interesting because in the Maya, basically the surrounding pagan religion, the land of Nephi, which basically what you're looking at is Noah came to power, they eliminated all the old priests and put in the new priests. But what you're looking at is a synchronization of the existing pagan religion, meaning they're taking the pagan religion and dovetailing or kind of forming kind of they call it synchronization, where you kind of got a mishmash of different religious principles. And you can see that even now. Meaning if you go to China, you go in a Catholic church, they allow, ancestor worship, burning the incense in the back. Christ looks Chinese. So they've kind of like incorporated some of the different things of each religion into theirs. The interesting thing is in Mayan iconography, it does show Maya kings dressed as women sometimes. And they think it may be part of bloodletting rituals. And if you noted, just at least the armies of Noah did delight in blood. It's talked about a few different times. It's also noted that King Noah had many wives and concubines, and there were harlots. But he also talked about there were other things that were just abominable to the sight of the Lord, whoredoms and all manner of wickedness. Abinadi noted this as well. Kind of my premise too is that Abinadi was probably one of these old priests from, when they came, that was from Zarahemla. They came and they kind of had had the old time religion, I guess you want to call it. But and also there's probably a good chance that when they came there were also some Nephites left, because when Mosiah fled, it says anybody who would listen to him basically followed him. It didn't say all the Nephites followed him. So you probably had a residual bunch of Nephites there when Zeniff came in that were basically semi-pagan, if you want to call them that. And then later on, Ammon, when he goes, they call him Lamanitish. So I do think those are probably Nephite descendants that had adopted kind of the pagan, what you call the Lamanite religion. And at the conquest, they actually found kind of sodomy, these types of things when they arrived, and where the men would dress in women's apparel, look very effeminate. So I do think, and it was also part of their ritual, some homosexual activity or sodomy. So I think given that cultural background, it's not unusual that maybe Noah was given a feminine, signed this feminine name by whoever signed it to him, perhaps. Or probably like kind of the question in the Book of Mormon is, were the names given to them? Did they give it to them at a certain age? Since they described the individual, maybe at a certain age, like the Native Americans did, or it may have been assigned after the fact, based on the nature of the person. So. And as far as abomination, it talks about abominations. Abinadi did is it's actually identified in the Old Testament where a woman, a man dresses as a woman. It's an abomination. So it actually kind of matches what it could fit in pretty well to the description given to Noah. So we've kind of gotten to a point where we kind of know enough that we can look at in Mesoamerica, maybe what we're looking at with Ziff. In that part of Mesoamerica, there's really not any, I have not found any metals to speak of archaeologically, but just to the south in Colombia and further down into South America, there was a lot of metalworking, even smelting that took place. And I do think you're probably looking at it as a trade item of some sort. The kind of interesting thing is the Maya generally just didn't even care about metals. Even when they were available, you don't find them much till later on in the Maya. So it's almost as if they didn't really care to have any, at least as precious metals and all. So what we consider precious metals. And there was also plating, gold plating known, silver plating. So I do think you're looking at some sort, Ziff is some sort of a base metal with either a gold leaf or some sort of silver plating on it. There's also the possibility, there's a metal called tumbaga, which is basically an alloy, and then they do certain things to the surface of it to create a thin layer of gold. and that's where I deal with in the metallurgy of the plates. I think Tumbaga is what the plates were made of, and I kind of go through and explain in the book why the engravings were black, how you can produce black patina when you're using this process. So, because Ziff is kind of the evil metal, and again, one thing you're looking at is the Book of Mormon. You're contrasting King Benjamin with King Noah. It seems like that's a theme Mormons putting out there. So that's maybe he left that term Ziff because it's an evil metal, so it actually has a religious connotation. That's maybe why it's still in there. So that kind of completes the discussion of Ziff. Yeah, and it was 40 minutes talking about one word. So, but hopefully we kind of went into some other areas that are of interest. Generally speaking, on metals in general, one of the things people don't really recognize is if you look closely, they use interchangeably the words, the metal itself and the ore of the metal, which tells you for the most part, except for, Nephi and maybe right back when the Jaredites arrived, you're not looking at smelting. You're looking, since the ore and the metal are the same, it's just a cold work. They can heat it to a point, but you're not looking where they're actually changing the chemical composition. They're just beating it, pounding out the dross, some of the material that's in the native gold that you find is like a placer deposit. So a lot of people they're kind of talking about smelting. You don't see smelting. It's like, I don't see that the Book of Mormon says that there is really that much particular instances. And even steel, for example, I do kind of one of my positions is you have this talks about the steel of the swords of Shul. Well, what they found with the party of Limhi talks about, well, they went, but kind of people think, oh, they just found these swords all over the battlefield. That's not what they're describing. They're describing a testimony of the people. And it has these records, it has these rusted, cankered swords that was with that they got. And I kind of think those are probably what they call the sacred bundle. There's a sacred bundle that each tribe kept of their sacred items, just like the Nephites had their sacred relics, the Leahona, and all that. So you're probably looking, those swords are probably the swords of Shul that were just kept almost as a mythological, because they were, as you remember, they were moltened out of the hill of Ephraim, which Ephraim means throwing lots in the air, these pieces of things in the air. So it kind of sounds like a cinder cone, a volcanic cinder cone. So which would be a kind of a mythological way of, and they didn't like, the steel can be made by, you don't have to smelt it. You can just take meteoric iron and heat it, and you get the outer surface as a steel. And you don't have to necessarily have the high temperatures, current blast furnaces and Cubot furnaces or steel making. You can get it even in a very hot campfire. And in this case, seems like maybe there was molten lava out of the hill of Ephraim, and they kind of formed it. And one of the explanations there, if you're kind of in the book of Swords of Shul, I talk about that there really isn't any obsidian available, the Tuxtlas. So that probably was maybe the only way that they could generate swords to come back in battle, is create them out of the steel. So anyway, that kind of wraps that up. Or if you have any questions, even on any metal item, the Book of Mormon questions, I can try to answer them. I haven't really published any book per se on metals. I've just kind of looked at it generally on my own.
Talk to us more about the Tumbaga, if you would, please. I think that while you mentioned that, it would help if you offer some clarification.
Yeah, what you have is there was a metal that they found when they arrived, the Spanish, which actually made them quite angry because it looked like gold. And then they took it back to Spain and they melted it, and it was mostly copper. So, and let's see. And so what basically you had, and this is in that book, but you have when Lehigh left, there really was not metallurgically the technology to separate gold and silver. And almost all of your native gold has some percent silver, 5 to 30%, because they form in the same geological pressure, temperature, environment when they precipitate out of, gold typically is precipitating out of hydrothermal fluids. And as it seeps through rocks and hits, that's why when it's found in veins, because it hits a crack in the rock, so the pressure drops. And so then you get precipitation of those metals and other minerals, quartz and those kinds of things. But so the question is okay, the Book of Mormon itself was not described as tarnished, which if you have gold and silver, some silver in the gold, you're going to have, because silver blackens with time. Gold doesn't, because gold does not oxidize in that way. You can get it to oxidize if it's very high temperatures or high pH, but in the normal natural environment, it doesn't. That's why it keeps its shine through time. So we're kind of looking at it and saying, okay, how is it possible, since they didn't have the technology to separate, how could we have these golden plates? There was a process that they had, it wasn't like a smelting process, that I found in the Leiden papyri in Egyptian, where they would basically use a plant acid. They'd have basically an alloy of copper and then silver and gold. So they had an alloy mix of some sort. And then they would use an acid, an oxalic acid on the surface, which would oxidize the copper and the silver, or sometimes just the silver. And if they heated and burnished it, they could get off all the silver and copper and leave a surface about 10 microns thick of gold. When the Spanish came, they found the Colombian Indians using the same technique. It was very interesting. It's called depletion gilding. And so that looks to be the technique used to make the plates. The other thing is you had, and so probably you're looking at Tumbaga, that's the name they called this. It'd be like an alloy mix. And of course, if you look at what Nephi said when he first arrived, and if you take out the chapter break that's not supposed to be there, it basically said they found ores of silver, gold, and copper. And then the next verse, if you take the chapter break out, which isn't supposed to be there, then it says he made these plates. So it's actually consistent with Nephi said as to how he made these plates. The interesting thing is also the plates were described as having a black stain in them. And so that's the question is, okay, so what was this black stain or cement? It was even described as a cement. So the characters themselves were black. They weren't gold. And interestingly enough, this is just another fellow, this is not an LDS person doing this at all, but he just was fiddling around with depletion gilding. And he noted if you do a certain procedure and heat it up, if you make scratches in it, you can generate a black patina, which I kind of figured out as a copper. I went through all the different colors of what you could generate, of the chemicals that you could generate, that actually protects the underlying base metal. Because what happens if you have this 10 micron thick layer of gold and you engrave through it, you're going to expose the base metal like copper. And so the copper will corrode. So somehow you have to protect that from corrosion. And this technique with the depletion gilding, heating it after the fact, will generate copper oxide, which can no longer be corroded because you've oxidized it. It coats it so it gives protection to the underlying base metal. And so that's interesting. It kind of explains the exact kind of technique that was probably used to make the plates. And so, I mean, I kind of explained exactly how the plates were probably made. And the other thing I did too, part of the study was I tried to figure out how many plates there were. So Emma had described that when she picked them up and moved them around, I mean, they were covered, that they would rustle, right? She said they rustled like parchment. So I actually had made all kinds of different thicknesses of what you would consider to be cold work copper metal with the right modulus of elasticity, the right hardness that you would expect from ancient working of the metals, and tried to figure out what thickness we were looking at to give you that rustling effect. So I found kind of a range of thickness. You couldn't get too thin because then if you tried to engrave it, you just puncture through the metal. So I figured out a proper thickness, then kind of took the overall, assuming that they were done by depletion gilding, back calculated, we know the weight. Well, we roughly know the weight, we roughly know the dimensions. And then I kind of utilized void spaces that were consistent with ancient polished metal surfaces reflection. So calculated kind of the number of the plates that were in the stack. And it's all consistent. It looked like about 4 karat. Kind of you have a copper or silver with 4 karat gold, percentage of gold, which is actually, if you look at if you have that sort of an alloy, it actually falls in the right concentration mix for you to anciently cold work it. So anyway, I don't know, Paul, if that's more than what you wanted to know about Timbuktu.
Let's open the floor. We've got the hands up and let's turn over to the discussion. Deb, you want to call on people?
I'm not, okay, Brian's got his hand up there. Brian, go ahead.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Hey, very good, Jerry. Interesting. Yeah, Jerry asked me to look up a bunch of words for him when he was first working on this. What was it? A few years ago, I think.
Yeah,
And,
I published this 2015. So,
Yeah, it was several years ago. And I was looking through the books again, the various dictionaries, and Jerry gave a good array of the possibilities. And that's the difficulty of this thing, is that that's all we can look at is possibilities because we don't know for sure. I noticed he said the layered stuff is what's in the Book of Mormon note or something, and I found that they're talking about layers with a sadi and two P's, which can also be F's. But
yeah,
the problem with that is that so it's good that you eliminate it. I mean, the sadi is often translated as S. For example, Sidon, it has the same sadi, but that's an S instead of a Z. But so it's very, very complicated. And a couple of things to keep in mind in our continuing search for this is that double consonants are doubled in the Semitic languages. In other words, for example, rabbi has 2 B's in it. In the Semitic languages, even doubled consonants are simply pronounced twice as long. So, instead of rabbi, it'll be rabbi, and they simply stretch out it's hard for us English speakers to do. In fact, I can't do it, but I can deal with it, in the research. And looked under Z and FF. Another problem is that only Arabic has F. In both Hebrew and Aramaic, it's originally P, but it can be pronounced as F, except when it's doubled, it almost always goes back to P. So that presents another complication that poor Jerry is trying to deal with. And as for
not anymore. This was 6 years ago.
yeah. Well, and you're picking up
and so that's also the question, Brian, is okay, you have this double F, for example. Are they trying to reflect? I mean, because in English, you're not looking at a transliteration. Meaning, if it was transliterated, right, why would you have double F, right? If they're just trying to put it in phonetic English, even early modern English. So I think what I was just saying is there's obviously something underlying in the original language, whatever it is, if it's a loan word in or biblical Hebrew, the double F must reflect. That's all. And like you're saying, you're looking to say, okay, there are two letters and they pronounced it that way. So that's the trick of trying to take, all we have is this English, word.
Right. And then, for example, Rabbana, I think they've got a double B in that word where the servants are calling Ammon Rabbana. I can't remember if it's
That's in the
double B or
language. That's in the
single B.
language of the Lamanites.
Yeah. Anyway, let's see, another thought. No, I can't remember it. But yeah, you're
And see, that's the thing. It's like where do you actually see that, your double letters at the end of a word? That's kind of what's curious. Sometimes you see rabbi, okay, there's two syllables that got, differentiated. Just, I have a section on that where we looked at it. It's like, well, we don't know. But I think we know enough that we can kind of, it seems like it's pretty plausible that this could be what it was. It seems to be from others.
I
Cultural
would
stamp.
I would agree with you. There's probably an alloy. I mean, if it was as pure metal like gold or silver or whatever, then they'd call it that. And since we know all the metals, in fact, brass is an alloy also, and they list that. And so I'm just guessing Ziff is a Nephite alloy that isn't common in our culture. I mean, and you listed several possibilities, and I think
See,
that's a
Tumbaga was not a word that was in the 1600. I mean, that's another one that was later.
exactly.
So
Right.
it's possible, so if you use that premise, okay, maybe it wasn't translated because it wasn't available, then, and then also
Right.
brass in early modern English is also pyrite. They use it, that's what they call pyrite in certain aspects. So I think that's even a possibility when they say brass.
Yeah.
And so I don't, so I again, that would be one where you'd say, oh, you got to have smelting to do that sort of an alloy. And I'm kind of like, well, only if if you believe that's the description of that. I think there's all kinds of pyrite used in Mesoamerica.
Yeah. Anyway, a good overview of the possibilities and interesting.
Jerry, is it okay if we go ahead and stop sharing the screen so we can see everybody, or did you want to
Sure.
refer to it?
So let's see. This picture I showed was basically this, trying to show you the depletion gilding here. That's on the cover of it.
Okay.
So stop share.
Okay, we got it. So Paul and then Rick, go ahead.
I'm intrigued by your assertion of the 10 microns of thin gold on top of the copper, which then, as I understand it, would potentially provide for the black oozing through to as they mark the gold, then the copper underneath would be the part that would show in the on the plates for translation. I find that to be an intriguing concept and potentially very useful. I'd like to have you go back though, because one of your earlier statements was about the Deseret, and I think you were suggesting that the honeybees would not migrate.
Well, it basically says they only took them on the first leg of the journey. It doesn't talk that's where Deseret is used. Again, if you believe maybe the premise I've kind of gotten Sumerian, if you can create a word in Sumerian that basically means stinging insect brought across the water, which they had bees in Mesoamerica. They weren't European bees, but they were stingless bees, so they didn't have stinging capability of stinging. So they did make honey, but they didn't. It doesn't. That's kind of that's one of the attacks on the Book of Mormon they used to use. They'll still use probably. It's like, oh, there's no honeybees found in Mesoamerica or anywhere in the Americas, European style honeybee. But it's like, well, it doesn't say it took them on that last leg. It just says it took them, as they they crossed waters with the barges. And when they arrived at the wilderness beyond the sea, then they actually created, the ones that are sealed like a dish, basically had a deck. So there doesn't, Book of Mormon doesn't actually say that they brought honeybees with them. And that may be one reason why they had to actually give an interpretation of it when it was when the came from the Jaredite record, that that's what it meant, because they may not have known that term. But anyway, so yeah, that's the explanation of bees. Like I say, the Maya actually had a bee god. So people saying there are no honeybees. In fact, each family would have like their own little hive where they would get honey. I actually have bees myself, so I'm kind of maybe a little bit more about bees than I should.
There were a couple of remarks in the chat, Jerry. One was that Bruce speaks Persian, and the modern meaning for the word is weak, W-E-A-K. That was shortly in your presentation. And then Terry Walker wanted to know if you were going to talk about Tumbaga, and you have mentioned that.
Yeah.
Rick,
Like I said, I kind of ran out of time. I was just wanting to respond to questions rather than to have a 25-minute presentation on it. So.
Right. And now, Rick, you are next, and you can mention your comment about Tumbaga if you want, and then Frank Fry will be after you.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Thanks, Jerry, for your presentation. That was really deep for that word, a short word. In Hebrew, there's a final pay. I don't know if that affects the doubling of the F sound, but they changed the formation of that character when it's at the end of a Hebrew word.
Yeah, I mentioned that. That's what I mentioned.
Okay. My question was kind of addressed by Brian. Do you think we still have Ziff today by another word? He was saying, well, yeah, maybe we have it today and we don't have we have a different word for it. What do you think we have some Ziffness in the world today that we could say it's like we could say Ziff is bronze, for instance, or something like that? I mean, do we have Ziff?
Well, yeah, I think kind of what I was trying to answer there is part of the reason it was left because it actually had some religious meaning culturally.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I would say, yeah, we have it either. It could be silver plated something or gold leaf or gold plated over a base metal, right? But there may have even been a word possible. That's why I had the and or, meaning you could say, okay, it wasn't translated because there was no word, but it may be that it was left that way so that we could try to discover the cultural meaning of it or the evil meaning of it. That kind of doesn't make sense. And that goes with all the other, because there's all these words in the Book of Mormon. It's like, well, why did they leave them? Why did the divine translator leave them in their original form? There's different ways you can look at it.
Yeah.
But I think we've kind of figured out pretty good for most of them now, using the biblical Hebrew or Egyptian, or as I've tried to do with Jaredite stuff, kind of a constructed story.
Yeah. That reminds me of when they're giving the account of their money system. And, they have all those words in there, Libna and Senine and.
Yeah, see, like Limna, for example, La in Sumerian is measure.
Yeah.
Imna is 7. And that's actually, if you lay out the system, it's 7 measures of grain. That's what it. So Limna actually, if you use a constructed Sumerian, I can explain all those terms. In a constructed Sumerian. I kind of do that in this big book. So
yeah.
Which 700 pages, of course, nobody's going to read it except for maybe Brian.
It's something that the people must have had within their houses because Noah wants a fifth of it from everybody.
Yeah, and when I say everybody, maybe it was just the rich people he was getting it. It's kind of like,
just rich.
Well, obviously, most of probably the farmers are not. I don't know how many farmers today own gold. So it's obviously these are
Yeah, nobody was found a loophole.
Right.
They list, I was wondering, they list gold, silver, iron, brass, ziff, and copper. I wonder if it's like most precious to least precious. And
Well, see, that's kind of the question you have to look at culturally too. Is everybody,
Right.
of course, we assume gold is most, it's rarer, but like the Maya didn't really care much about it. They were more worried about jade, as were the Olmecs. They had different precious things. And in fact, if you look through the Book of Mormon, when they always say silver, gold, silver, they're almost losing it as a literary couplet. So I'm not even sure they really were talking about silver and gold. They're just talking about the precious, whatever precious things they had. So it's almost like a translation method of not, because again, kind of my premise is the Book of Mormon is this translation. It does not have a lot of cultural thing. You don't have even these words we're talking about. They're not Mesoamerican languages for the most part. Nias, maybe that's like chili peppers and Mayanese, but for the most part, it seems like the translation is not trying to take through, and it seems like a lot of the culture is being left, meaning it's not translated through. It may have been there. And I think it's kind of as what was talked about last week. You're looking at a managed translation and interpretation, right? And they're interpreted, not really translated. And so the divine translator, if you believe Joseph Smith, or it was done and given through the interpreters, whatever you think, it still has a divine source, and it was for a particular reason. Like I worked as a translator I have for 30 years, freelance, and then sometimes they would ask me, they want me to translate this computer manual. Okay, we want one for the computer people, we want one for just normal people. So I obviously I didn't put everything in, that I was targeting to a specific audience, right? And so
yeah,
and so I think maybe these terms that we're looking at are not really, they're really being translated in a way that we can maybe figure out what they mean, and they have some underlying cultural meaning. And the names we know do. And so, and that's why I kind of said, okay, look at Noah, for example. Looks like you can actually find Noah that matches exactly what he is.
Yeah.
So those are, so
Okay.
I think when we're looking at these things, it's kind of like Brian says, you can maybe look to the original language, but it's, what original language and what time, because, Hebrew is not the same. It changes just like every other language. And so
Okay.
I do think they kind of picked the time and language, standardized it, said, here's how we're going to translate these words, leave them in for some purpose, right?
You mentioned they had some kind of an acid treatment, and you mentioned oxalic acid, if I heard correctly.
Yeah, there's different plants. If you smush them up, you can get oxalic.
Oh, because that was going to be my question. What was their source of this acid that was necessary to do this etching or converting?
Well, if you want to try it yourself, I think Morning Glory is one that you can get.
I got that in my yard.
Exactly. So if you want, just coat your wedding ring with it, see if you can get a better shine.
Rhubarb has it too.
A better shine. I got enough shine already.
One thing I forgot to mention on the Timbaga is like when I think it was it Josiah Stoll, somebody was helping take the plates and out the window, to hand them out the window, and he said he saw like a corner of them, and it had like a slight green cast to it, which you actually can get that if the Timbaga is not 100% pure. You get a little bit of oxidation of the copper that gives you that green. So I think that's also a reason why I think that's what you're looking at for the gold plates.
Okay, thanks. I'm done. Appreciated it.
Okay, Frank, looks like it's your turn. Go ahead. And then after you, it's Monty. You have to unmute, Frank.
Sorry, thank you. Appreciate the presentation. That was quite interesting, Jerry. Wanted to mention a couple of things. All of your topics were really on point and had a lot of good information with them. There were, as you mentioned, honeybees or stingless bees in Mesopotamia. They are also in Mesoamerica too. And
That's what I was
Yeah.
saying. They are in Mesoamerica.
I've found them there and I've tasted their honey. It's a medicinal honey. There's two varieties. One of them is makes a hive in the ground, and the other make hives in trees. Interesting thing about them is that you disturb their hive, and the bees all go inside. Instead of the normal honeybee, you disturb their hive and they all come out to
Right.
defend the hive. Well, these guys don't have any defense, so they just all go in. And it's speculated by some that may be how the stingless honeybee got here, is that they were brought over by the Jaredites. And that would be another evidence for the Mesoamerican idea. You could possibly have one or more hives of those in a boat, and we know they were closed up, but we also know that they didn't harm people, and that when you did bother their hive, they would all go back into their hive. So that's just one of their interesting characteristics. I have some preserved stingless honeybees here in my home because it was interesting to me, and I've pickled them in alcohol. Then the Ziff, have you considered the possibility that the list of things that were being used, they were ornamental for the walls of the buildings and stuff? Obsidian was also used to ornament walls in Mesoamerica. At Teotihuacan, I've seen that, and Paul and I think, both saw this together. Down there, they would carve deep into the surface of the rock, and then somehow place obsidian in those carvings, and that was used at Teotihuacan. I don't have any specific evidence of that being used in Maya land because I spent more of my time above the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, but that's a possibility. Ziff is mentioned with metals that could be used for tools, and the Ziff, the obsidian was used as tools, the knives and hatchets and all kinds of things too. I've always considered that as a possibility, but I really did like your linguistic analysis of it too.
Yeah, that's kind of where you have to go. I do think obsidian was a term that was available to just translate it even in the early modern, but I'd have to check that again. I have a lot of notes. I just hadn't gone back to this quite some time ago. So.
Going on to the tumbaga, there were two different ways that you could make tumbaga. One of them was the etching with acid, the organic acids, and another is heating, annealing, and pounding. You heat it and pound it. The oxides would come off in the pounding process, and it would bring the gold to the surface. So that's one of the other ways that tumbaga was made.
Yeah, most of them used both, right? So they would actually heat, they would put the acid on, then they would heat it and burnish it. So the acid would help, basically because it assists in the oxidation.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But it can be done. It's a lot harder to do without the acid. So.
Annealing it with fire also strengthens the metal, makes it more flexible, you might say. And when you pound out metals to make them into sheets, you have to anneal it, or it becomes brittle and it will crack. So The heating process, I think, was kind of essential for that, but it also helped out to
Yeah, and actually in my
bring the
book,
gold to the surface.
in my book, I actually go into a lot of the details of the metallurgy and kind of have these diagrams showing the alloys that you can actually work efficient. Because if you have silver, gold, and copper, it creates a different, you have to look at that because alloys change the structural, the capability of structure of the metal. So it kind of showed that these concentrations would work for ancient metalworking, others wouldn't. And I just kind of showed that actually the calculation fell within the range of percentages of copper versus gold that would actually be where you wouldn't have that effect.
Okay.
Because sometimes even if you anneal it, it's if a certain alloy makes it very difficult.
Yeah, there's been all kinds of speculation about how much the plates weighed. People said, well, a solid cube of gold that size would be, hundreds of pounds. Joseph couldn't have carried those. Well, if they're made out of tumbaga and if they're plates that have spaces between them, then the weight would be very much within that range.
Right. And that's what I did too, is I said, okay, what's your deflection of your ancient, I took Mesoamerican, well, actually some South American, says, okay, they manufactured plates. What was the deflection? So the measurement, the deflection, meaning what were because they weren't perfectly flat, they weren't made like we did now. And they would polish them. So I kind of had a range and said, okay, expect this much distance. And so I kind of calculated number of, it's a range. I didn't say, okay,
sure. Yeah.
how many? So I says, okay, taking all these parameters, then the question is, can you fit the Book of Mormon on that surface area? And you could. So
how many plates did you finally settle on?
Like 300 to 600. So it's, it's depending on a few different things.
Okay.
Again, it's kind of, the seal portion is kind of tricky, right? Because I don't know.
Right.
And I also showed too, because it was described as solder at the side, the seal portion looked like there was some soldering or effective solder like wood. And so I kind of showed they had that technique available to them. I mean, ancient metal workers in South America, clearly on the coast, had that. Actually did really excellent soldering. You couldn't even, like I have a monkey head, you can't even tell. They had one half of the head. So I kind of basically said, listen, everything that's been described, kind of like I did with the geology, I guess. I said, every description of the plates, you can find an explanation for it. And just like you're saying, this hauling these, pure gold. Well, and then these people they make says, oh, look, I made it out of tin. And it's like, well, yeah, you're using tin that's rolled in modern techniques, so there is no deflection. So, of course, they're fitting right against each other.
Yeah.
You have this deflection, and you're going to get, it's about 50%, really, roughly. Is airspace, I suppose, what you want.
Did you allow for writing on both sides of the plates?
Yeah. I even had a little bit of okay, I've got burring. So let's say they were polished, and you had a little bit of burring around the engravings. Yeah. I calculated even the gold, assuming that the D-shaped loops were also, because they were not described as being, corroded either. So I thought, okay, you're going to have depletion gilding on those too, because the key is you do need the gold to cover the surface so you don't have the corrosion.
Right.
Anything that's metal, presumably you would need that. And then I also did in the book, might be interesting, is I looked at the interpreter, the bows.
Yeah.
And because those are silvers, like, okay, why weren't they black? But platinum, actually was mined in Colombia, one of the only places it was ancient. Worked. It looks like probably platinum. And you don't have the stones talked about among the Jaredites as being in spectacles. So it's pretty much probably the Nephites did that. Who did, I don't know, but which of them. So anyway, I kind of explained that too. Say, hey, here's this.
Just because they were not
rates.
mentioned doesn't mean that they weren't. They might have been brought from the old world that way.
Possibly.
The Lord prepared them.
Right, but like the bows themselves, meaning the Nephites could have been. I guess what I was showing is you have platinum being, you don't really show platinum back that far in Mesopotamia.
Platinum is really hard to deal with.
Right, but yeah, but they did have it in.
Yeah.
So I would say probably based on the fact that in the old world, they didn't really have the platinum that we know of, but in the new world, they did. Seem likely that maybe those were constructed in the new world. Again,
Okay.
one of the things is I'm trying to show is not, okay, I don't have the exact answer, but I could show reasonable ways that this could be explained.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you for your presentation. It's good.
Auntie, it's your turn. Are you still there?
I'm still here.
Okay, I'm waiting for the Ziff pun. What's the Ziff pun?
Well, in my poor little pea brain, you got to keep in mind, I know very little about metallurgy and practically nothing about archaeology. So applying that vast knowledge I have, when you were talking about a modern translation, I thought, if you take this stuff into a gold merchant, their word for it's going to be counterfeit.
Or a coin dealer.
Yeah. Well, and like I said, I think that's one of the reasons why I thought, well, this is a good match, because kind of counterfeit just matches Noah, right? He's a counterfeit king.
Kind of like our modern alloys we make our money out of.
Yeah, who knows? I don't even know what a penny's made of anymore.
Yeah, it was getting too valuable, so they had to make it out of something else.
The copper today is worth 3 times more than the penny is.
Yeah, that's what I wonder if they're still using copper so much.
Well, I'm going to say good night to everybody. You have a nice evening. Thank you very much. I appreciated your presentation.
Good
Welcome.
night, Monty. Paul, you got your hand up there. Go ahead.
I was intrigued by looking, I included the map there that had the circle on it. The original map that I intended to include showed a bunch of mines in Guatemala, in what presumably is the land of Nephi, according to the Mesoamerican theory. And those mines included a wide variety of metals. Zinc was one of them, and zinc is not one that I've heard any discussion about. I'm wondering to what extent it might be significant.
Well, like I said, I've seen those maps. I mean, I have those maps, but I don't, there's no evidence of them being mined anciently. And a lot of those, when they say, oh, there's zinc, it's in some complex ore that even today may be hard to extract out, and depends on the chemical nature of it. So that's why a lot of people always throw up these metal maps. See, look at all the metal that's in Mesoamerica. I'm kind of like, well, yeah, it's not really available to them technologically, even the smelting, even if you believe they had smelting, a lot of that is not, they couldn't get it out.
Zinc is very chemically active. It would, if you tried to smelt it, you have to go through a different process besides smelting to get zinc.
Yeah, well, that's kind of like
It's not
brass.
like tin.
Yeah,
Tin,
I mean, a lot of
go ahead. Tin is, it won't oxidize when you heat it, but zinc would.
Yeah, and actually a lot of the ancient alloys that had zinc, it was only because zinc was actually present in the complex metal. It wasn't even, they didn't even know it was there, because zinc will volatilize. In fact, like I worked at a steel mill, we hated it. I mean, you added it to some things, but it would coat the top of your furnace because it would come out of the bath, and then you get it forming zinc all over the top, making it less efficient. So yes, again, the other thing about ancient metallurgy is it's not like they didn't have these handbooks of chemistry. It was kind of like an art sometimes, and the historians often described it just based on the color. They didn't know even the technique, and some we don't find, like Corinthian bronze is mentioned, but we've never found, the archaeologists never found it, and it was described by Pliny. And so sometimes, a lot of times it's used to kind of attack the Book of Mormon, and I'm saying, well, we haven't excavated everything, number one. The other thing is, brass may be pyrite. In fact, it made sense, because if you look at where it's mentioned among the in the Olmec or Jaredite, they mentioned that, oh, we heaped up large quantities of dirt. But they didn't say that for brass. Sorensen says, oh, that proves that they're smelting because they wasn't heaping up large quantities of dirt. But the only time you heap up large quantities of dirt is if you're doing placer, and if you're sifting through and getting the gold out. So, and the reason that the brass wasn't, because pyrite wasn't available to the Olmecs, they had to import it because it wasn't found in that area. So that would actually explain why they didn't have to, they weren't mining it, they were just trading it in. So there's other explanations. So I think, you know, the kind of when you're looking at metals in the book, you got to be a little careful about just assume, you know, we have this modern knowledge of metallurgy. Oh, they're just doing this. It's like, well, sometimes they just didn't know there was the color, like the historian, oh, that's brass, just because it looks like brass, but
Right.
they didn't necessarily know the because these are kind of trade secrets that the metallurgists kept.
They were.
Yeah,
And in
Nephi
fact,
knew a
they-
lot of them. Nephi knew a lot because he probably was a metallurgist, right? It's or knew how to work metals. But not
I'm
all.
reading a couple of books right now about the ancient Israelites and the Phoenicians and the people in Carthage. The Carthaginians were largely Israelites, and they that group controlled the western side of the Mediterranean, and they kept the Romans away from the Atlantic Ocean and the 10 islands, which were Britain, for hundreds of years, because it was a trade secret.
Yeah. So I guess all I'm saying is metals seems to be this area that seems to be kind of, you know, they always anachronistic list. It's always on there. I think there are explanations that actually match Mesoamerica pretty well. And another thing is we haven't found, I mean, there's not a lot of indication that they were using, even when they said they had gold, it doesn't necessarily mean it was all worked and everything. It just means they maybe, like the Aztecs, they just had little measurement cups of it, gold flake, you know, yeah, they had others that worked in it. When they're talking about, and you know, the different measurements of the gold, you're probably just looking at volumetric. It's not a weight thing. They're just like, they had little cups that they would use. That's how they measured their grain, you know, it was volume, it wasn't weight. They didn't have scales in Mesoamerican markets. They had those boxes that had different, you know, compartments. So they could put this much here, and that was so many, you know, square inches, I guess, of cacao versus grain.
The
least that's what they-
Zapotecs had those kind of measurements.
Right.
They're in the museum down there in Oaxaca.
And I think that's interesting. If people look at that, the metronomic system that is given in the Book of Mormon, people think, oh, they're out there trading in the market gold and Anton and Sinai, but it's like, actually, if you look at it closely, they're just tying it to measures of grain, and then they're just tying how the silver commodity works versus the gold commodity. It's not like it's saying that was their method of exchange. It actually refers to measurements of grain. So that was their grain is really, if you're looking for again, not a monetary, it's not money, but it's kind of the common method of exchange. And that's what they were looking. You're looking at commodity exchanges
In our
Book of Mormon, not money. Even though you call it money, there's a word money in the Book of Mormon, but it's just really, it's a method of exchange. It's not like you know, that they didn't have pieces of gold that they were out of the market spending. You know,
our farming methods back when I was a kid, you don't see them anymore now, but you have quarts, pecks, pints, bushels. Almost no one uses bushels anymore, or pecks, either one. But you know, there's 4 pecks in a bushel, and then there's barrels. Those are all volumetric measurements for
right.
food, grain, and vegetables and stuff like that.
Yeah, and like I say, it was if you lay out that system, it actually does make a little more sense from a volumetric exchange, because you have like 7 of this and then 3. So they had added up pretty well together.
Mhm.
You know, if you're trying to do exchanges across from gold to silver, but again, and maybe that's actually why Mormon listed them all. It's like, that's another question. Why did he list those? Well, because they weren't really commonly known, perhaps because they were such rare items. The gold and silver are not necessarily common to everybody.
I find it fascinating that Then we had a 40-minute presentation on one word, and then another hour of discussion about it afterwards. Bruce Nelson, we get a presentation for an hour on one phrase out of Helaman, and so that ought to be equally fun because, wow, it's just amazing to me how you guys are able to extrapolate so much information from a single word to a single phrase. So I'm looking forward to next week because to me this is good. This is good fun. Thank you, Jerry. This has been just a delightful session.
Well, I promise if you have me on for cure loms and Q moms, maybe 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I'll try to keep you on the more general topics. And one of these days, we'll be back on the serpents in the narrow neck. I think that's one of the presentations that we need. But you've got a whole bunch of them that I'm anxious to pull you in for. So thank you for letting me call on you on a short notice because I really appreciate your willingness to fill in when I had a gap. And here's a chance to pull in a lot of valuable information that, wow, it's so impressive to me to see the wealth of information that's hiding among the participants in the forum.
Well, and I think, like I said, I mean, for me, I just like studying the Book of Mormon. And so people say, why do you spend like a whole book on Ziff? I says, well, because I like it. So it's not, and nobody else is really writing much, so it's, I kind of pick stuff that people just don't dig into very much.
Bruce is still with us. Bruce, let me put you on the spot and see if you have a introductory comment to entice people for next week.
Well, I once heard a broadcaster introduce his piece by saying that you and I are going to find out what I'm talking about at the same time. So I may be a little more, I've been pondering over it for a while now since you asked me, but I'm still working on the form. So thank you for the challenge.
Well, and your comment in there this evening about what was the translation you came up with? Weak.
Zaif, yes. It's the Persian pronunciation is Zaif, and it means weak. And sometimes it's used like poor. Religiously, they talk about a person's duty to take care of the Zaif among them. But that, and I actually, because I know it from Persian, I don't know how related it is to Arabic or Semitic languages. Persian comes from Indo-European rather than the Semitic that the Arabic has. During the Babylonian captivity, there was a lot of influence, both ways, in language and other ways. But linguistically, I don't know if that's closely related or not. It's just, I can also say in Arabic, the same word is often used as a given name. And in that case, it usually is translated as guest. So that might be a quite different meaning of the same word. A big difference between Semitic languages and Persian is in the Semitic languages, the vowels don't carry meaning. But in Indo-European languages, they do. And that's the biggest difficulty in learning Persian, is because the vowels aren't typically written, and yet the whole meaning of the word can change if the vowel changes. And in Hebrew or Arabic, you don't run into that difficulty.
Where did you learn Persian?
In Iran. I joined the Peace Corps, and to my immense surprise, that's where I was sent to do my service. And I know quite a few people whose names you would know from the news.
Did you get to see the Behistun monument there?
I certainly did. Yes.
Wonderful. Did you get any photographs of it?
I may have a few. I did not do a lot of photography. I was worried about taking a camera because of dust and things like that.
Yeah.
but I did run into a British engineer, and I had an RB-67 for a week or so.
Oh, my.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that wouldn't have that's not going to have a long telephoto lens on it.
No, it wasn't the long telephoto.
I'm looking for any kind of original stuff of the Behistun monument
Oh, really?
that's original. I hate to just use stuff off the internet. I know you can find it all over the place, but I'd be interested in seeing what you have if
Yeah,
you're
I
willing
don't
to share
think
any of it.
I don't think I have a photograph of that, unfortunately.
Okay.
I probably do have friends. I visited with, actually, you might be interested. My mind goes blank on names now, but when I visited, I was in the company of one of the great Iranologists from Harvard, and maybe his name will pop up as I'm talking here, but he was in Iran with OSS during the Second World War,
Mhm.
and just absolutely fell in love with the history.
That's when they were using the Behistun monument as target practice.
Well, I'm not sure that
That was
was
terrible.
quite quite that accurate, but there may have been some rounds that went off.
If you can find any photographs of it, I would be glad to give credit to anyone who shot them and makes them available
I'll see what I can find.
in anything that I use, but I'm looking for some originals. Thank you.
Richard N. Fry is who I was thinking of.
Richard M. Fry.
Richard N. Fry.
N. Fry.
Yeah.
Never heard of it, even though it's my family name. So
Oh,
is that F-R-Y, F-R-Y-E, F-R-E-Y?
Frye, I believe.
Y-E.
Yeah. If you look into that field, you'll see. In fact, the Iranians called him Iran Dost, or friend of Iran, and there were plans to bury him in Isfahan on the banks of the river there. Although I
Wow.
think after the revolution that kind of stopped that. But he could read all of the ancient inscriptions. So in places like Behistun and also Ganjnameh in Hamadan, where you had the inscription side by side,
Yeah.
he could read each of them. And there were a couple of places where he even pointed out that the scribe had made a transcription mistake when he was
Wow.
carving the rock. So he was really good at that kind of thing.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I know there were 3 different languages used with that inscription on the Behistun monument.
Yeah.
Susan and
Yeah. Let's see.
like we use, many different languages for the alphabet that we have.
Right.
They were doing the same thing with cuneiform.
Yeah. Well, they actually had different alphabets that they used. But the person that ran my training program had been in the Peace Corps in the 60s and came back and got a PhD at Harvard. And then he went back to Iran to run Peace Corps training programs. So that's where I met him. His name is John Limbert, and his wife was my Persian instructor. And after that, he joined the State Department and got sent back to Iran just in time to be a hostage.
Oh boy.
Yeah, he was a junior political officer. So just before COVID, I sat down with him and also with Jason Rezaian of the Washington Post, who wrote a bestseller called Prisoner, was also in prison there for a long time. And both of them told me that they would go back to Iran in an instant if it became possible. And
Wow.
John said, I'm not going to blame the whole country for a few idiots. So, quite remarkable that people who have really suffered in those kinds of experiences still have very, very warm feelings towards the country.
Ed, I don't see Deb on any longer. Jump in.
Listening to this discussion tonight, essentially about one word, I can't imagine how many hours Jerry spent on it. But last week we were talking about Oliver Cowdery asking for permission to help translate the Book of Mormon. And the advice was given to study it out in your mind and then ask me if it's right. Is it any wonder he was unsuccessful? The book would never have been translated if we had depended upon his ability to study out these these kinds of problems. So I think that perhaps the Lord had a little irritation in mind when he was bothered over and over, I'm sure, by Oliver perhaps pestering to be included among the translators. And so once he was told, I guess, to study it out, it wouldn't have taken very long for him to figure out. He couldn't do it. But this was such an illustration of the difficulty that he would have faced. Anyway, I just thought that was very interesting. That's it.
You gonna sing us out tonight, you and Rena?
Well,
Looks like Rena's asleep back there.
I appreciate the fact that here we have the need to refine our thinking and to go through the refiner's fire to get something that's the pure ore takes us back to the pure core that I believe the Lord is calling of us. And so I'm grateful for the questions and the comments, and especially for the remarkable research that Jerry has shared with us tonight, because what a blessing to have people share together from the common interest in the Book of Mormon and the Scripture. And I really appreciate the blessing to the forum that it's been to have Jerry on several times. We should. Ed, you want to get a hand up again?
No, I don't know how. I guess I can lower it.
But Deb's not on to turn his hand off, and he hasn't turned it off. It's
All right.
There it is. He got it. Paul, how is Rena doing?
She sang it, so that's a pretty good sign. But she's been suffering from the sciatic nerve problem, and so we're looking at the possibility of spinal surgery to address that matter. And so your prayerful support for this quest would be appreciated, because she's been suffering with that for more than 2 years now.
Yeah.
But for tonight, good night, the Lord is watching o'er you. Good night, his blessings go before you. Good night, and we'll be praying for you. So good night, may God bless you.
Good night.
Good
Buenas
night.
noches.
See you next week.
Okay.